Today we're going to go through revolutionizing management reporting with native functionality in Sage Intacct. Sage Intacct has some really powerful reporting features, and we're going to go through a case study that had some extremely robust requirements around reporting and dashboarding. And while it was a really interesting project and we learned a ton, so we're pretty excited to share it with everybody. At the end of this presentation, you're going to understand how to create versatile reporting structures, which are really the building blocks of all these reports, and then put all those building blocks together to create impactful reports. And then taking all those reports together and packaging them up to create management reporting packages. And that could be 5 reports, that could be 100 reports. It's pretty versatile and it's immediate. At one click of a button, and you could email them out, you could put them on a shared drive, or you can just give people access to run it themselves. This completely reduces the reliance on Excel-based reporting, which, as everyone knows, is very error-prone and time-consuming. And at the end, we'll go through the dashboards that we created in this case study and different KPIs that are on those dashboards. This is really some cool new development we did for this company.
We did this implementation for a 300-person professional services firm. This professional services firm had multiple divisions. They had an accounting practice, which was tax and audit, that rolls up into one division. Then they had another division of all their different consulting services. So they had to see everything at the division level and at the company level. We migrated this company from the Great Plains ERP system to Sage Intacct. So Great Plains is an on-premise software, and we moved over to Sage Intacct, which is a cloud ERP system. And in this implementation, we had to do multiple entities or multiple legal entities by this company. So we had different entities that were in the system that all required their own reporting, and each division required its own independent P&L statements, and as well as we had to slice and dice all the information by office. So you had to see all the division P&Ls, and then you had to see which office all the information came out of. So from a reporting overview, at the start of the implementation, everything was entirely Excel-based. It was the CFO downloaded all the information out of Great Plains, also coupled it with a bunch of different other source systems and other source information. They downloaded into Excel. He had a lot of different Excel tabs, and then he'd combine all that data at the division level or the service line level to come up with a total consolidated view. It was pretty labor intensive. He did this on a monthly basis. After he was done consolidating all that information, he would publish it by putting all the different reports that he created in Excel on a shared drive that everyone had to VPN into. So you needed your company's computer and you'd VPN into that shared drive to go grab that information. And of course, because it was in Excel and downloaded from all the source systems and put together, it lacked that transactional visibility. So you couldn't see exactly where the data came from. If you had a question about it, you couldn't drill into the data. You'd have to call up the CFO, who then would take the question and have to call up his accounting staff so they can go get the answer, then relay it all the way back. They couldn't just log in and get it themselves. So what we moved to was moving reporting to entirely Sage Intacct based. So we put it all within the system that we developed, and that allowed us to give self-service access to all the different stakeholders. Instead of going to that shared drive, they can just go log into the system and run any of the reports that they had access to on their own right when they wanted to. This also provided drill down capabilities. So they can go in and drill down, go into their P&L reports. If they had a question on it, they can click on the data and drill into it, and we'll show you a little bit more how that works in our demo later. And we also built them dashboards, which is something that they didn't have beforehand. But we built specialized dashboards depending on the type of user that they can just log in and use and see immediately right when they open up their home screen. So now we're going to go into the implementation overview just to explain the whole system that we built. So as we go through our reporting, you understand all the different modules we were using and the mechanics behind it. For starters, we implemented a bunch of different core GL modules. So the GL itself, AP, we used purchasing transaction definitions, which is a functionality within Sage Intacct to have a pretty robust approval process for purchases. We also implemented cash management. When it comes to AR is managed in another system, our time and expense system that they were using. And what happens is, to get the AR into Intacct, they download that information out of the practice management or the time and expense system, and they input it into Intacct as a journal entry. So that's how they get their AR information, so you can do your full-blown reporting. And time entry is also managed in that same legacy system. When it comes to reports, these were the different requirements. We need to have a balance sheet. We need to have an income statement on a couple different views, a trended income statement, so you can see it month-by-month comparisons. We also have to have it by division, so each division or service line, you're able to run the report at that nitty-gritty level. Some reports I'm particularly proud of is that we were able to create a trended budget and, more impressively, a forecast income statement, which we'll talk about a little bit later on the mechanics behind it, because that's not exactly native functionality, but it can be done within the system. And then we developed a budget versus forecast report. So as time goes, which is something that actually this company didn't have beforehand, and was very valuable because they use it all the time now. So you can constantly compare their forecast data to their budget and see how they're tracking. From there, we needed to put all of these different reports into a monthly reporting package. And we also created a bunch of different dashboards, like I mentioned before, and more specifically, something we call a net income dashboard, a revenue dashboard, and some KPI metrics, which are a year-to-date view and a current month view. All right, so that's an overview of the implementation, the reporting requirements, and the case study itself. Now I'm going to turn it over to James to really go through the configuration efforts and the nitty-gritties of how we put it all together.
Thank you, Brett. So just to give you a bit of a mini agenda to describe how this next portion is going to go. Really want to start out with some of the basics of financial report building within Intacct. We're not going to take you through a whole reporting training on how this is exactly done, but we'd like to give some conceptual examples of how this works within the system. We're going to do the same for how the Intacct system handles statistical data. Again, just to give you an idea of how we were able to get this data to work within the context of what we were trying to do. Next, we're going to talk about some of the report construction strategies. There are a few different ways to go about building the sorts of reports we were looking at within Intacct. So we'd like to talk about some of these examples, what we did here, and then hopefully arm people with the knowledge of how you can use these different approaches for your own reporting. And then finally, some delivery techniques once you've gone through all the song and dance of getting all that data put together, how you're actually going to get it across to the people that really need it in your organization. So starting out with some of the basics of report building within Intacct. Within Intacct, the basic building block of every report is sorting accounts into account groups. Account groups are really exactly what they sound like. There's no trickery here. It's just organizational buckets for you to place your accounts. So if you take a look at the screenshot on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see something everyone should be familiar with: balance sheet. So starting off with the short-term liabilities. The short-term liabilities will contain pretty standard base-level accounts. Those will be rolled up, as you can see in the hierarchy displayed, to the current liabilities, into the liabilities, and finally into the liabilities and equities section of our balance sheet. Again, so you're taking your accounts you're actually entering the transactions into and sorting them into the manageable hierarchies to use on your reports. That will end up taking you, being able to give you much larger account groups to put together into the reports you'll actually present. And then final point here, which will take us into the next slide, is that these same principles also hold true for the statistical accounts within Intacct. So as I mentioned, the statistical accounts function, the exact same as your general ledger accounts. Instead of a debit and credit, you very simply have an increase and decrease. So you import your data or enter it through the system into your statistical accounts. If you take a look at the screenshot here, we delineated these statistical accounts through alphanumeric naming conventions instead of just numeric. These statistical accounts can be a very valuable tool for collecting a wide range of non-financial data. So as you can see in the example here, there were a couple in the implementation here, we collected different sorts of hourly data. Again, this was a professional services firm, so we weren't exactly counting all that many numbers, but again, different kinds of hourly data, full-time employees, headcounts, WIP, and accounts receivable over 90 days as the billing was being done in the legacy system. Final point on statistical accounts, and one that we will keep coming back to throughout this presentation, is that you can use them in calculations with the GL account groups that we were just describing. So again, you're collecting the data at the account level, but once you organize these accounts into the groups, both financial and statistical, you can use them in calculations to help you get some really good metrics about your company. So in that vein, one of the most important statistics that we collected throughout this implementation was what's called recovery per hour. And if you take a look at the screenshot, you can really see, this isn't conceptually that difficult to understand, but starting out the screenshot, you can see that we have the structure type in the middle of the screen, which is designated as a computation. And then moving a little further down on that left-hand side screenshot, you can see, as I mentioned on this previous slide, that we're actually taking two account groups and performing a calculation. So within this calculation, it is the total revenue for the firm divided by the billed hours for the firm, which gives us this statistic called recovery per hour. It's a very valuable one. So moving into the next, moving on to the next screenshot to show you what this would look like on a report. Again, we have that total revenue account group, which is being used in the screenshot to the left. We also have the billed hours account group, giving you those two statistics right up top, and then underneath you see this calculation that gives you that exact metric. So moving into some of the strategies on how exactly you're going to build out these reports. So a conceptually similar one to the initial account group is what Intacct refers to as a filtered account group. So a little bit of background on how Intacct looks at data. Intacct actually has what we call dimensions. And so these dimensions will be different items you'll enter in on various transactions that will give you, certain aspects by which to categorize it. So a very simple example of this for this implementation is the departments. So if you see on the screenshot on the right-hand side, you have that same recovery per hour calculation for several different departments within the firm. So the audit department and the business performance management department, we had an Intacct department. And so again, each of these represents transactions that were actually entered with a certain department designated. So what you can actually do here with this data is create a new account group that filters all transactions by the specific dimension. So the example we're going to keep running with is the department. So the screenshot on the left, you can actually see that filters by the service line audit. And so again, that moves into how we built this report. Each line you see is an individual account group filtered by the department dimension within Intacct. That goes for the simple statistical ones, the financial revenue audit group, as well as the recovery per hour calculation group. If you extrapolate the amount of time this might take to do this, again, it's very conceptually similar to an account group. You're just simply filtering the data, but you do have to make sure if you're using this to construct a report that you have all the account groups configured to display the dimensions that you would like to see. Intacct also provides another way to structure your reports and a different construction strategy that's based around the concept that we were just discussing called dimensions. So within Intacct, as I mentioned, you can code different information at the transaction level that'll inform the transaction called dimensions. In years past or in older accounting systems, these would have actually just been different segments of the same chart of accounts string. However, in Intacct, the concept of the chart of account string has been done away with, and the dimensions actually are able to stand on their own and are counted separately from just the general ledger account. The reason that this is significant to our purposes here is that Intacct actually also allows you to organize entire reports by the dimensions instead of the conventionally structured reports, which are organized along account groups. So what this actually looks like is instead of having the to go back to the balance sheet example that we used earlier of having more granular groups roll up to larger ones, such as your assets, your liabilities, and equity, you can actually pick different dimensions, such as your departments, or customers, or vendors, or locations, and organize the reports along these lines. Now, this is a very valuable tool because it can allow you to provide, really different perspectives on the company. So, a couple different examples of how we use this throughout this implementation was that when you're creating these types of reports, while the dimensions inform the rows, you actually put your account groups into the columns. The account groups, again, being the organizational backbone of the financial reports, the more conventionally structured ones. So what we did for that was, using the same time period, we took a look at a bunch of different statistical metrics across the company within the same report. So what this allowed us to do was really take one report and expand it over a bunch of different metrics throughout the company that really, was able to provide a lot of unique information that was scattered throughout the system just on the one report. So you can actually do really interesting things, with these, allowing you to just take a look at, for example, what each customer might owe you across different locations, or just as one example, or really just and whatever way you can think of structuring the dimensions. So, and then finally, one of the advantages of using dimension-based reports is that you are able to edit the dimensions very easily and have any edits flow through onto the reports that you use these structures on. So, as I mentioned earlier, when you're using the filtered account groups, you do have to duplicate them for each dimension you'd like to represent. So extrapolating to what that means for your maintenance is that, say your business added a new department, and you were using filtered account groups by department on your reports, you would then have to duplicate that account group and then filter it by that new dimension for every instance in which you're using that in a report. However, in the same example, if your business added a new department and you're using a dimension-based report, you would simply add that dimension to your dimension structure that forms the basis of this report. And then from there, it would flow through to all the reports that are using that same structure. So I'd like to elaborate a little bit more on that concept of dimension structures that we just introduced to build the report. So as I mentioned, on a conventionally structured report, you use your accounts to build account groups, organized along larger groups such as liabilities and equity or assets to form the balance sheet. Here, what we're doing is we're constructing a dimension structure that will reflect the dimensions that we would like to represent on our report. So sticking with our example of departments, within the business, we're going to move left to right on the screen. So on the left side, you actually see the report and how a dimension structure has been inserted there. So it looks very similar to the roll-ups that we saw previously, with the individual departments rolling up into the consulting division, and the same thing, the audit and tax departments rolling up into the tax and audit services division. So moving into the screenshot in the middle, you can actually see the middle level of the hierarchy, which is the consulting division. This actually contains the individual departments that we are just referring to. So again, going back to the concept of the hierarchies, which Intacct uses throughout all its reporting, it's a critical concept. You can see that they've been built up individually into the division. And then finally, moving to the screenshot on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see that the individual department member that makes it up. So again, bringing it back to the hierarchies, moving up from a smaller one, single department, to the division, and then finally to the structure that you can use on all your reports if you want to look at the departments or construct these same structures for any other dimension within the system that you can think of. So now we're actually going to take a look at a demonstration of building one of these reports and how it looks in the system. So first we're going to go to the menu and navigate to our financial report writer. There's a couple different ways to do this. We're going to go to the general ledger menu and navigate to our financial reports. As you can see, there are a great deal of reports in here. We had a fairly significant reporting requirements for this client, but so we're going to now go ahead and add a new one. And we're going to show this very simply. We're going to build a very quick revenue by service line report. The client we were working with here referred to their departments as service lines. And you can see here on the menu that there's actually an area that you can click in between the report structure for accounts and dimensions. So moving over to dimensions, you can take a look at the helpful diagram down in the middle there, and you can see that it has customers. Flipping back, you can see that that's a little balance sheet screenshot with assets and liabilities and equity. So just a little way that Intacct helps you out knowing which report's going to be which. And so now that we're on our dimension-based report, we're going to move into the rows and actually select one of our dimension structures. So you can see here in the drop-down menu, as I mentioned, you can construct dimension structures within any available dimension within Intacct. We're going to stick with our service line dimension here, but just so you know, that, again, this is a very versatile way to build your reports. You can, again, see all of the dimension structures that we built on the way up to building these reports. So as I mentioned the concept of hierarchies earlier, we're going to select our all service line group. So now we went ahead and put that onto the report. We're going to select the summary level data to put on to display once we're finished building this report. But again, you can see the roll-ups within the firm-wide structure that we built. So now we're going to move on to the columns and actually put the data into the columns. So I mentioned earlier that on a dimension-based report, the columns will actually be formed by your account groups. So just a little bit about our report writer here. The first column is always going to be either your account or dimension name. The second column, you can select your column type within Intacct. There's a great deal of variety within the column types you can select. You can select some dimension attributes, computations, variations between periods, or on the budget. But for our purposes today, we're just going to stick with our actual data. Reporting periods also able to select. Intacct comes preloaded with a lot of default reporting periods. If you have more specialized reporting requirements, you can make your own, but we're going to stick with the current month. Also able to customize column headings. But most importantly, we're actually going to pick out our account group that we constructed earlier, and then again, these would form the backbones of other reports. So as you can see, there are a lot of these in the system, a lot of smaller groups, again, making up the larger groups within the hierarchies we built. But luckily, Intacct allows you to simply start typing the name of the group that you're looking for, in our case, revenue total, and it'll start populating that with the available groups. So we're going to select our as update to make sure that we are looking at the data that we'd like to be seeing. And go ahead and take a look at the HTML preview of this report. So again, this should look pretty similar to the ones we were showing earlier, but just underline the fact that if you take the time to configure your dimension groups, you can very easily construct reports to show a number of different metrics. So again, these dimension groups and structures, extremely versatile tools that Intacct gives you that can allow you to easily produce reports that'll look the same throughout your organization. So I'd like to kind of conclude on the report construction strategies. Just to be clear, we really don't have a very favorite type of one. We're really just trying to arm you with the tools you need to construct the reports that your organization actually requires. So starting with the ones we covered first, the filtered account groups, these are easily replicated from the account groups you've set up already. Intacct is a very easy duplicate function to allow you just to simply duplicate and make one simple adjustment that allow you to filter on any of your available dimensions. Again, they're very just conceptually easy. You won't have to, a lot of times you're just simply taking data you've already had in the system and filtering it to reports to give you a more streamlined look at what you're actually trying to get to. As I did mention, though, also they require additional maintenance. Anytime any dimension is going to be expanded, you will have to duplicate the account groups to make sure that you're including any of the new dimension members that you're putting into the system. And like I said, it's a little less flexible, a little more time intensive, but it does allow you to take a look at some of the very simple account groups that you looked at and just get that filtered to what you want to be seeing. And then going to the dimension structures that we covered, they do require a little more initial effort to construct. We stuck with the example of the departments that our client used, and I know that one is conceptually simple, but if you want to look at certain subsets of customers, vendors, locations, sometimes these do require a little more thought and effort into what's actually going to be useful for your company, what's going to be useful, or if you're implementing, what's going to be useful for your customers. So you do have to make sure that you're actually putting the time and effort to figuring out what's going to work as opposed to just throwing data on a wall and hoping it's going to stick. But as I mentioned also, these can be maintained and edited a little more efficiently once they're fully configured. You just have to edit that actual dimension structure, and the edits will flow through to all the reports you're already using. So now we'd like to get into a reports overview demo, taking you through some of the things we did in the system and what we could do with them. So for now, I'm going to turn it right back over to Brett.
Thanks, James. So I'm going to go through all different reports that we configured in the system. We'll highlight 3 of them, but just to give you a whole understanding of the breadth and the scope of these reports. So I'm hitting play, and just like with any ERP system, there's usually multiple ways to do the same thing. So now to get to reports, we're going to go to reports and then report center, as opposed to before James went to general ledger and then reports. As James mentioned earlier, we have a whole lot of different reports. In this particular system, we have over 100 reports, and we're just going to scroll down to show you how many there are. Sometimes this list is a little bit hard to go through, so Intacct has some pretty good functionality that we always encourage all of our users to use, but you're able to create favorites for your reports by clicking on that star, and right when you click it, it goes from gray to orange. And what this does, it puts you in your favorites list, which you're going to click on the top left. Now it loads, and you can see this is a much more scaled down version of all your reports, so you don't have to go through the whole entire report repository. So for starters, we're going to run the detailed income statement. It's a little bit more of a familiar report for everyone, so we're going to start there. We have a bunch of different prompts. Starting off, we're going to look at offices. In this case, you can look at individual offices, or you can look at Maryland or Virginia, the whole states. We also have a whole bunch of different service lines. These are all these different service lines are due to different reporting requirements. I can run this report for all the different corporate departments to see the expenses related to them. I could do it for the individual service lines, or I could do it at a higher level and run it for the whole entire view of the company. By not selecting anything, it runs it for everything. And of course, I'm going to select my as of date, so I want to run it as of June 30th. Clicking OK. Now the report's running, and now I'm going to expand it so you can really take a look. And for the moment, I'm going to pause the video so I can talk through it, and you can kind of gain your bearings on this report. I know James was talking about dimensionalized reports versus using a typical reports with accounts in the rows. In this case, we have the accounts in the rows. If you look on the left side, we start with the revenues, and we get down to expenses, and of course, at the bottom, total net income. James was mentioning account groups and dimension structures, and you can see on the left side here for revenues, we have a bunch of accounts, our revenue account, filtered by different dimensions. So in this case, we use account groups, and the reason being, and this is how James mentioned beforehand, that there's no better or worse when it comes to account groups or dimension structures. It's really just what's needed, and we want to make sure that you know these things are available. So as you go through building your own reports, you will know that these are the tools that you can use. So on the left side, we use revenue filtered by the different account groups that are filtered by the different service lines that we have in the system. When it comes to the columns, you can see the first one is month to date, and then we have our month to date budget. We have a comparison column, but looking at favorable and unfavorable variances. Then we have year to date actuals versus year to date budget, and another comparison column. And then we have our prior year month to date and prior year year to date, just as reference points. Click OK to keep playing with the video, because the next thing I really want to show is the drill through capability, because this is really powerful. So in this case, I'm going to go into our revenue intact line, and we're going to click anything that's blue text as a hyperlink, which means you can drill into it. In this case, we're going to drill into that blue text under the month to date. And all these numbers are fictitious. They're really large numbers in case you haven't noticed by now. But I'm going to expand this, and this is a general ledger report. So when you drill through, what it does is it first brings you to the GL report, and you can see on the left side we have our accounts by our service lines. You can see some other information. All the way on the right side, you can see the debit and credit that makes up this particular transaction or this particular line in the GL report. If I clicked on that blue link underneath credit, where the number is, that would then take you to the actual transaction. In this case, it's a journal entry. But maybe if it was an AP bill, it would take you directly to the AP bill. And then from there, you can see all the lines that made up the AP bill. You can even view the history of who created it and if it was modified to a strong audit trail. So it's really easy to drill into the data. So now we're going to get out of this one. And we're going to go run some of my favorite reports. We're going to start, the second report we're going to run is going to be the flash report, year-to-date recovery per hour. We keep coming back to this year-to-date recovery per hour or the recovery per hour statistic so you can just get an understanding and keep something consistent throughout this presentation. But now we're going to select our as-of date, going back to June 30th again. That's just the date that we chose to load all the data into. Clicking OK. Then going to expand the report. This is a report that everyone here should be a little bit more familiar with because we've been harping on this recovery per hour metric and different versions of this report, but this is the finalized version. This is a dimension-based report. You can tell on the left side because that we have our service lines or our departments, which we're using synonymously, on the left side in the rows. Then in the columns is really recovery per hour, which is our account, and we have it by a couple different time periods. We have it by year-to-date, and we have it by prior year-to-date. Then we have our two variance columns, dollar variance and percentage variance. We made this same report for a number of different metrics. James earlier on showed a screenshot with all these different metrics we had in the system. So we used all those metrics to make this report, and we use that dimension structure that James kept referring to on each of the reports. We only have to make one dimension structure, and we reference it each time on the report. What's great about it is that if we have a new service line that comes on board, which happens every so often, we would just go into the dimension structure, add that service line, and then it would pull through on all the different reports that are referencing that structure. So that's a really nice feature here, and it's a good way to really understand the end result of what we built. But now we're going to run my favorite report. We're running the budget versus forecast income statement, and we have the same prompts here where we have office and service line. We'll leave them blank so you see a consolidated view, so you see the whole entire company. We're going to scroll to that same as of date, click OK, and then we're going to run it. This is a little bit more of a complex report to build, and I'll kind of talk through some of the mechanics and what you're looking at. So first let me pause the video. We can talk through it. Okay. In the rows, which is what you should be familiar with by now, it looks just like our income statement, maybe a little bit more consolidated, but it mirrors our detailed income statement report. So we have our accounts, some of our filtered account groups. The columns is where it gets interesting. The first column is a forecast year total. So if this report is run for June, what we're looking at is our 6+6 forecast, which is 6 months of actuals and 6 months of forecast data. And what you're seeing there is that total view of both half of the years, the actual data plus the forecast data put together. Then we're looking at budget year total. This company in particular loads their budget every year, which is great because then we can put it into Intacct and we can report on it. I know James showed earlier that you can do the budget to actual comparisons very easily within the system. Then we have our variance columns. I want to talk about that forecast year total. The way that Intacct works with budgets is that there's no native budgeting or forecasting functionality, but what it does a great job of is storing your budget data. So you can upload your Excel files and store all the data in Intacct and then report off of it, which is really powerful stuff. Most clients that we work with are doing their budgeting and forecasting in Excel, and then they're consolidating all that data to produce your reports. Here you can upload it to the system and let the system do all the consolidation. For the forecast report, what's going on in the background is we have some hidden columns and we're hiding our actual data. So we have one column that's actuals, that's year to date, and that's hidden. Then we have another column that's forecast data, that's current month through the rest of the year. And then we combine those two to give you that forecast year total. The way that we get the forecast data in the system is we upload the forecast data to a bucket, in the budget module, to a bucket that we just call forecast. In the budget module, you can have as many buckets as you want. You can title it budget. If you want to archive your budgets, you can do 2018 budget and so on. In this case, we also have one called forecast, and that's the data that we're pulling onto this report. So this is a new report that we developed. It took some clever tricks of just understanding the system and different building blocks within the system to figure out how to produce an actual forecast report. And then from there, we're able to make that forecast and budget comparison, which is not something that this company was doing previously. It's something that they started doing once they had the capabilities, and now it's one of the main reports that the CFO uses. So some really powerful stuff. Just do some simple tricks in understanding the report construction strategies and how to put it all together. Great. Such a really good overview of some of the crucial reports that we built. As you saw, there's way more than just these, 8 to 10 reports you've seen on the screen. We had around those 100 reports that were built to put into all the different reporting packages, which we'll talk about in a moment. I'm going to turn it back over to James.
Thanks, Brett. And so as Brett was just mentioning, one of the most critical aspects of this whole project was once we collected all the data, built all the reports, got them all set up the way that the client wanted them, we actually had to think about how we were going to deliver them into the hands of the stakeholders. So one way that Intacct allows you to do this is through what they very helpfully call report groups. Again, like I said, much like account groups, these are exactly what they sound like. There's a pre-configured list of reports that can be generated simultaneously. So you can see in the screenshot here the list of about 5 or so that we created for this client. And again, this was just to allow them to, instead of having the CFO upload these reports onto the local drive, it allowed for the controller to really take charge of this once the month was closed and all the data was finalized, to be able to generate these reports all at once. A couple of nice things about this is that you can actually place security onto these report groups. So not everybody within the company, even people who have login access to the company, can see these or run these report groups. These can only be run when the controller decides that they are able to be run and that the data is finalized. So it really allows for this process to be centralized and making sure that everyone is looking at the same thing at the same time when this is distributed. However, one of the more flashier ways to deliver these reports is actually through Intacct's dashboard functionality. So the dashboards can be configured really to provide a lot of different views of information that has been configured within the system. It has several key features, all of which are related to the account groups that we discussed earlier. So the performance cards provide a very quick at-a-glance view of certain organizational performance metrics. We'll take a look at these and the other ones coming up in just a minute in a demo. You can also place financial reports onto the dashboards, as well as financial graphs, which are similar to financial reports, but again are organized along the same account groups that you configure to build them. Another great part about dashboards is that they don't actually just have to be just all full of fancy graphs or just dumping grounds for your financial reports. One of the interesting things we did for this client was build an AP dashboard. So the AP dashboard was something that gets used pretty much exclusively at month end, but it has a vendor, it has an aging report for accounts payable filtered by vendor, and additionally it has a list of all the outstanding charge card transactions within the system. So again, not conceptually groundbreaking, but this really just does allow for reports that would be in 2 different places within the system to be placed in the same area, same work area where the AP clerk is able to access them at the same time. So just another way, it doesn't have to be the flashiest thing, but these dashboards really are able to increase efficiency at different levels throughout the organization. All right, so finally tying it all together, showing you some of the bells and whistles that we were able to set up here. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at the dashboards that we set up. And I mentioned different functional dashboards. We organized several different dashboards for this client. The flash reports, current month and year to date, represent the statistical data and metrics that we collected. And then we also organized a net income and revenue dashboard. So here you can see while the dashboard loads, the structure of most of all these reports should look familiar. It's the firm-wide structure built to show the statistics by department. The dashboards, we can filter the entire dashboard, not just the reports, by any of the dimensions that we've chosen. So again, you can see some of the ones we could also filter. The individual reports can also be used to filter the entire dashboard. We also have our as of date there as well. So again, just a really simple way for that we provided for the client stakeholders to log in and get access to these reports all at once. This way they can actually get that real-time access that people were looking for, all in one spot as opposed to individually. And now we're going to take a look at our revenue dashboard. So you can see along the top as this is loading, the performance cards I mentioned. Again, these are conceptually pretty simple, built along the lines of the statistical accounts that account groups that we created within the system. So it's just showing the performance of that account group and the data that makes it up as compared to either the prior year or the budget, depending on what the client wanted to see. So then moving into some of the graphs, you can see that we have a budget versus actual for the firm, budget versus actual by the service lines, total WIP by the service lines as well. So again, these were all built on the account groups that we imported the data, all the statistical data into. We just simply had to configure graphs to make, to be able to represent it visually. And then finally, one of the last neat features of the dashboards is the drill-in functionality that we showed a little earlier is also available on the dashboards as well. So we're going to take a look at the billable hours by service line. We're going to just click right into the consulting division, and that'll bring up all the billable hours that for the departments that actually make up that whole division. So again, you actually are able to interact very neatly through these at the dashboard level very quickly to get into that underlying data as well.
So just to point out, this is what the CFO of this company is doing beforehand. And I'm sure this is familiar to a lot of people. You can see on the bottom, you have a ton of different tabs, and this workbook goes on and on, pulling data at each service line level, and then having tabs that compile it all, and then another tab that puts it all together, and then another tab that does calculations on it. Of course, there's a million links and references, and when things don't go right, the whole thing breaks, and he has to figure out where it is. So we're able to move them off of this and put them into a system that does all that work for them. All they have to do is make sure the data is properly in the system. So concluding this project and some of the successes is that at the end of the day, I'm sure this is pretty common. This saves a lot of time. It also reduces a lot of risk for data error. Every time we go into our clients, they're always doing a ton of Excel-based reporting. We've heard that month-end closes take up to 7 extra days just to pull together reports. And the people you're having put the reports together are usually the best people in the accounting department and everything. So now it's removing them from doing their accounting activities and doing some analysis and moving them into doing report building activities. So by actually using the system and using all the capabilities it has to offer, you reduce that time, you free up your people, you gain hours back, you reduce your close cycle, and you get even much more powerful reports. I'll give one example from this particular client is that one of the heads of the department was out for medical purposes, and the CFO was looking for an updated forecast. But unfortunately, the people who were underneath them weren't part of the previous forecast, and what they were able to do is go in the system, run that forecast report for the previous quarter, pull down all that data, and then look at all the projects they knew about and compile it all back together to put that forecast, that Q4 forecast, which is needed in this situation, together within a couple hours. If they didn't have that data in the system, That could have taken days and days and days, and they probably wouldn't have got the numbers right. There would have been explanations that they just didn't have because someone else built the forecast. But once you put it all in one spot, it's very easy for someone else to go in, drill through, understand what they're seeing, and then come up with their conclusions and make proper decisions on it. So it's a pretty cool story that we have from this particular client that was directly affected from being able to pull all these reports together. So that's the end of our presentation. Just for some contact information, if you want to reach out to us, if you have any questions about your current reporting, if you're using Sage Intacct, if you have any quick questions, feel free to reach out. You can see here, I'm Brett Schneider, my number, my email address is up here. Same thing with James Cotter. We're happy to answer questions. I mean, we do this for a living because we enjoy it, so we love talking about it. So feel free to reach out, and I hope this was very informative.